Whew, that wind is really kicking up out there. Good thing you've got a warm spot to sit and some great stories to listen to. With me, Dr. Plague. Thanks for coming to today's Cozy Horror. I hope you're having a great day, and if you're not, or even if you are, I hope that these stories bring you what you need today and help you have a much better day than what you might be having. All right, enough of my rambling. Let's go ahead and get started. I know it's a little bit early, but it's right around the corner, so let's talk about Easter and how we celebrate it. I know most of us have egg hunts, or eat the ears off of chocolate rabbits, or eat too many Peeps and then sleep on the couch all day, but some places have different celebrations, and the city in question here is no exception. So, let's learn how the town celebrated Easter in the old ways. People often say that Easter is religious in nature, that it's something Christian or pagan in origin. I'm here to tell you, it's something far different than you've ever dreamed. I grew up in a small town in northern Europe, one of those picturesque little villages that you see on postcards. The kind with lots of farms, a cute little main street area that's all cobbled stone and brick buildings, a little downtown area with an open-air market, and lots of hard-working people in rustic clothes with various farming implements herding animals to and fro. I lived above one of those shops with my parents. They were in a general store, and I helped out until I left when I was 16. They were good people, and I don't think they really agreed with what was happening. They weren't the kind of people that fell in with religious fervor, but they understood the purpose for it, understood the purpose it served the community, and they participated in it, even if it was unwillingly. The celebration of Lady Eostre was not as old as the village itself, but almost. On Easter Sunday, 12 of the town's children were pushed from their homes and led into the square in the middle of town. Their ages were between 6 and 15, and the event was always preceded by merriment before the night itself. There was a carnival that week. Feasts were eaten, gifts were given, and then the night that everyone dreaded inevitably came. I don't remember much about those nights. I remember the underlying dread I felt as I sat in my room, the silent tears I cried without knowing why, and the relief I felt when I'd awoken the next morning to find that it was daylight again. That and the screams. I still hear the screams sometimes when the nightmares come. To understand why this happens, you'd first have to understand Our Lady. The Lady Eostre was once a hallowed deity. She was the goddess of dawn, and the rays she brought had nourished the land for the founders of our region. Eostre had shown them where to go, shown them where to plant, and the bountiful harvest made the townspeople rich and the cities prosper. They praised her and her generosity, praised her for her gifts, but she told them too late that there was a price. You see, she hadn't told them what else lay in that valley. There's a cave near Father's Glen, a huge, dank maw that breeds nothing but shadows and pain. Those who go in never come out, and it's where the children of Eostre reside. Legend says that once they were birds, creatures of the wind who were free to fly as they would, but Eostre turned them into hares, an animal more fitting for a season of fertility and growth. The hares were pleased with this. Now they were free to explore the land as they had once explored above, but over time, they grew to hate the children of men, who often hunted them and their smaller cousins. When the people moved into the valley, they began to hunt the rabbits for food, which infuriated the hares. The valley was said to be thick with rabbits and hares at one point, but the humans were in for a surprise as they filled their stew pots. The children of Eostre, the hares, began to come out at night and hunt the men, and many, hares and humans, died as a result. The ensuing skirmishes were good for no one, and Eostre stepped in. In her infinite wisdom, she brokered a trade, a contest of sorts. If you would hunt the humans, then give them the same chance they have given you. For one night, the weakest of them will hide and run from sunset to sunrise, and any you catch will be your prize. Once a year, you will send 12 of your young ones, one for each month that you have hunted my hares, and they will search for them. If they find them, they may take them back to their cave. Those who they do not find will go free. For every other night, My hairs will remain below the ground, never to hunt a human under my protection. This is my decree, and all shall abide. And so it has been from that day on. I was chosen only once to participate in the festival. The town wasn't huge, maybe 30 or 40 children of the desired age at any given time, and it wasn't uncommon for a name to come out of the kettle more than once. My friend Maria was chosen 4 times, but managed to hide until dawn on all but the last time. A sibling could go in your place, and sometimes they did. I remember one year that a boy named Elaine had went in his sister's place and was supposed to have killed 3 of the hares before they got him. I never saw the bodies. Everything was cleaned up as it always was when we came out the next day. Most years, I just sat in my room with the doors and windows locked as I cried into my arm and tried not to listen to the children below as they screamed. Most years, only a few lucky kids came back. I was fortunate enough to come back the time I was selected. I suppose I wouldn't be telling you this story otherwise, would I? I was 8 when I went out to do my duty, as my mother put it. I was scared, but part of me just couldn't believe that I would die or never come back. I was young, and all children believed themselves to be immortal. Hell, even the thought of rabbits coming to get me made me giggle. I could just imagine little bunnies with torches and pitchforks, hopping along as they tried to catch a bunch of terrified children. Even as the nun told us about it in the local school, I giggled a little, earning myself a smack with a ruler for my insolence. You won't think it's so funny when you're in the streets some night and they come for you. I saw my father when my name was drawn, and I couldn't understand his terror. I had heard the screams, of course, but I believed they were just people putting on. I knew that people got killed, but I didn't really believe it. Why would my parents send me out to do something that would get me killed? My parents loved me, and I knew they wouldn't want me to come to harm. I was confident that this was just some Father Christmas or Tooth Fairy sort of thing, just a bit of harmless hogwash for children. I had never actually known any of the children that didn't return, so it was like nothing had changed from year to year. How small my world was, and how frightening it seems now that I was so naive. So I sat at the feasts, played the games, enjoyed myself that week. I saw some of the other children who'd been chosen, and while some looked scared, others clearly didn't grasp what was in store for them either. We joked about rabbit hunts and bringing carrots to feed the bunnies. We all laughed and talked about how brave we would be, but none of us really understood what was about to happen. Then came Sunday night, and I think it all became real to me. My mother called me into the kitchen, just as the sun began to sparkle at the edge of the horizon. She presented me with some gifts for tonight. She had bought a pair of soft black pants and a very tight shirt. She put a pair of soft shoes on my feet, and I could feel their delicate material hug me gratefully. Listen closely, because what I tell you might save your life. On the night I was chosen to take part, I hid in the horse shed near the drawbridge. The smell of the hay seemed to make me harder to find. If you bury yourself deep in the stack, you should be safe until morning. Don't try to fight them. Don't be careless or brash. Just run and hide and survive. I love you. Your father loves you. And we wish there was any other way but this one. We wish there was some way to help you, my father said, suddenly coming from his study and startling me. But this is all we can offer you. Good luck. We hope to see you in the morning. Then they hugged me, both of them enveloping me in their shared embrace, before leading me to the door and showing me out into the semi-darkness. I walked to the square, unafraid as the gaslights flared cheerfully. Why should I be afraid? This was my home. I had ran over these streets with my friends. We had played by the fountain in the square. We had gone to the market and bought candy and toys with our allowance. And we had gossiped and giggled as we walked to school. Nothing here could hurt us. Nothing here could threaten us, as the warm stones of our hometown wrapped us in a cocoon of safety. This was just a game for grown-ups to play, and it would prove as hollow as the stories of the boogeyman or the goblins who came to take away naughty children. I could see the others as they flitted into the square, but they were not quite as chatty as they had been earlier. As the sun set, casting the last of its light on the town, we heard the bell toll and saw the mayor come out onto the balcony that overlooked the square. He looked resplendent in his long coat, his shoes with the buckles gleaming in the dancing torchlight, as he stared down at us from his high perch. He looked sorry to see us here, but resolute in his decision. He would carry this out, then he would step back inside, so we didn't have to watch the results of his actions. We give thanks to Eostre for a beautiful harvest, for the valley that we live in, and for the gifts that she has given us generations ago. We ask her to watch over these little ones as they hide from her children. May she take pity on them and let them come home again. He said more, going on for what felt like hours, but my head had turned from him as I heard a noise. It was the harsh flop of a too large foot, the echoing thump of heavy footsteps, and as I looked, I saw them. There were 3 of them, all tall and lithe, with arms and legs too long to be human. They didn't so much walk as they galumphed, as if walking on 2 legs was never something they would become used to. As the mayor droned on, I saw one of them become too eager and step close to the edge of the alley they were hiding in. Its fur was snowy white, a speckling of brown making it look as though it had freckles on its chest and nose. Around its neck and across its shoulders, to my surprise, I could see feathers, and I remembered suddenly that they had once been birds. Its mouth had a distinctly beakish look to it, and I felt cold dread creep into me as this creature hulked at the ready. It held a delicate-looking flint knife in its too large hand, and my humor at the thought of being hunted by bunnies was gone now. These were no cute little hopping creatures you sometimes saw in the glen. These were like the trolls and goblins we were told stories about, old and mean and utterly devoid of human kindness. As the sun sets, I beg you all to flee. Go now, before they're set loose by that ancient promise. Some of the others had seen them too, and I was suddenly aware that the press around me was thinning. Children of all ages were running, fleeing into the corridors and alleys we all knew so well. I was running too, leaving behind the few who were still gaping up at the mayor as he moved away. They would give me time to run as the creatures found them first. Their screams were high and terrified, but mercifully short. I ran for the stables, just like Mother had told me to, but the hares didn't stay in the square for long. The streets echoed with those strange hopping thuds, and I could hear them as they caught others. Children were easy to track. They wept, their feet thudded loudly, their breathing was much too deep, and the hares seemed to locate them easily as I ran for my life. Unlike the others, my shoes seemed to whisper over the cobbles. They were soft, hugging my feet like a second skin, and though the night was breezy, I never heard so much as a flap from my clothes. I was like a shadow as I traveled the streets of my home, and when I saw the bridge looming up in the distance, I put on an extra burst of speed. When I heard the flapping, galumphing sound of those 2 wide feet, though, I threw myself against a nearby wall and stayed as quiet as possible. I could hear it as its feet slapped at the cobblestones, its nose twitching as it tasted air that likely stank of humanity. The sounds of its twitching nose made my skin crawl, the noises akin to bugs that had nested under a loose cobble. I put a hand over my mouth as my fearful breathing threatened to give me away. I couldn't tell how long I stood there. Time seemed to creep by as the creature looked and sniffed. Fear time is always different than actual time, and the stretch of seconds can seem to take decades in that moment of extreme terror. Then, mercifully, he left, and I ran like the rabbit I had become for the stables. The stables were empty, the horses taken elsewhere, but the hay trough still remained. I plunged into the itchy depths, making myself into a ball as I shuddered at the bottom of the pile. The clothes my mother had given me were long-sleeved and long-legged, so I had only to cover my face so the itchy depths wouldn't give me away. The scent of hay was strong, and the dust that coated me made me stifle a sneeze. I had to be silent. I couldn't do anything to give myself away. I lay at the bottom of that trough for hours, my adrenaline running high, and my ears straining for the smallest sound. I heard them when they came in the first time. There had to be at least 2 of them, their feet slapping at the cobbles as they searched the stalls. I heard them turn over tubs, open closets that were only occupied by horse tack, and grumble in their strange language when they found nothing. When one of them came towards the hay trough, I thought I was done for. It dug through the hay, pulling handfuls away as it searched, and I pressed myself as flat as I could against the bottom. I had to stuff my fist in my mouth, careful not to rustle the hay, for fear that I would be given away by a scream as the creature got closer and closer to finding me. My fist was sweaty, the taste of hay and dust likely to choke me, but I held absolutely still as it threatened to uncover my hiding spot. When it sneezed, the dust getting into its nose, I almost sighed in relief. It scooped out a few more handfuls before stopping, sneezing again as it moved away. Those deep thumps took it out of the horse stall, and I was left to shiver and shake as my adrenaline coursed freshly through me. Somehow, I couldn't have told you how at the time, as the adrenaline ebbed off, I fell asleep at the bottom of the trough. When I awoke, it was daytime, and the night of terror was at an end. My mother found me, hay still clinging to me as I walked towards home. She pulled me close and kissed my hair, thanking Eostre for my safe return. Given that Eostre was responsible for what had happened last night, it seemed silly to thank her. That night was 15 years ago, and I've since moved from my small rural town. Hamburg makes the place I was born look like a dirt track, and after college I found work easily as the foreman of a textile mill. My parents call me once a week, sending letters in this age of email instead of getting with the times. I've settled down now, had a child of my own, and our conversations always seem to turn to when they will get to meet their grandson. My answer is always the same: when you come to Hamburg to see him. After all that I've witnessed in that place, after sitting in my room for 8 years with the knowledge of what was going on outside those walls, I'll be damned if I'll let my son anywhere close to those damned Warrens and those snuffling monstrosities. So when you hear about the resurrection, as you bite the ears off your chocolate bunny, count yourself lucky that you live without the fear that was such a big part of my childhood. Remember that somewhere there's a bunny that would love nothing more than to bite the ears off of you. Out of the festive holiday fire, and right into the fields with this next story. We all hope one day to find the perfect person. I know I've certainly found my perfect person, and I couldn't be happier with them. But that perfect person often comes with difficulties all their own. Things to learn, things to do, and sometimes what you think is enough may not be. So, let's hear about a marriage that was perfect, except for one little thing. She was the perfect woman. I have no idea how I managed to catch her attention. Our relationship, our marriage, it was all perfect, except for one thing that neither of us could have foreseen. We met in college. She was working towards her English degree, and I was studying business. My major required me to take an English course, as did hers, and when she asked if the desk next to mine was taken, I was almost too stunned to answer. Kathy was beautiful in that artless way that some women have, and she smiled as I fumbled over my answer. That would have been the end of it for most people. I had fumbled my one chance, but Kathy wasn't like other women. She told me later that she had found it endearing, and she suspected that she was already a little bit taken with me when she sat down. When I saw you from across the room, I just knew that I wanted to get to know you better. We talked a little bit before class, comparing schedules and going over the usual getting-to-know-you chit-chat. When the teacher arrived and class began, I found myself snatching little glances at her as she bent over her notebook. She caught me looking once, and to my surprise, I saw her smile at me. I was smitten after that smile, and when Kathy invited me to have lunch with her after class, I didn't even have to think about it. We were dating a week later, and as we got closer, should have noticed the warning signs of problems to come. I suppose I understand how it escaped my notice, though. Few people would have considered utter peace and pure relaxation a problem. When we walked hand in hand, I would get this feeling of utter peace throughout my body. When we kissed, I felt like nothing in the world could hurt me. She made me feel safe, made my problems melt away, and I knew I wanted more than the few hours a day we got to share with each other. Her college schedule made it difficult to go out more than twice a week, and my own class load kept me busy too. Part of the reason we had such little time together, though, was Kathy's commute to and from school. Kathy lived an hour and a half from campus, and couldn't begin to afford an apartment on her meager student income. The job I worked, plus the leftover grant money I had, paid the rent on my studio apartment, but not much else. Another person paying rent was nice, but I couldn't say that was the only reason that I offered to let her live with me. I also wanted her close to me. She made me feel good, made me feel safe. Being in her presence made the dark world in which I lived more tolerable, and I wanted that for more than a few hours a week. I offered to let her move in, and after a week of mulling it over, she agreed. That weekend, we combined our meager possessions, and I slept like a baby in her arms that night. As we began to spend our evenings together, the problems became more apparent. Problems is a terrible word for it, because in the beginning, it was more like a godsend. When we sat on the couch, our hands linked, I would find myself getting drowsy. When we would cuddle on the couch, our bodies pressed together, I would lose minutes at a time, and my eyes would grow heavier and heavier. The feeling of peace I found in her presence put me at ease, and that ease led to some of the best sleep of my life. I would sleep more deeply than I ever had before, and wake up after 8 hours refreshed and ready to start my day. Kathy seemed pleased with the attention. She'd only been with one other person before we started dating, but I could tell that she wondered why I hadn't slept with her yet. Some women's feelings would have been hurt by this, but Kathy had been raised in a very religious household, and must have assumed that I was simply waiting till marriage. The truth was that, while I would have loved to have slept with her, the sleeping was the problem. Whenever we got close, my arms around her and our bodies pressed together, I would find myself blinking and suddenly losing long periods of time. Sometimes she would lead me to bed, sometimes she would just sleep with me on the couch, but I would always wake up next to Kathy with a deep feeling of fulfillment. I had assumed that she was feeling the same way. I often thought that maybe this was the feeling that we gave each other, and it made me feel good to bring her the same sort of peace that she brought me. This went on for about 6 months, and I thought that things were going well. We went out to dinner, we had friends over, we went on dates, and seemed to be living together with few problems. I had been tentatively looking at rings, preparing to pop the question and make it official. Besides the matter of intercourse, I thought we were happy. Then one evening I came home from class to find her crying on the couch. I hadn't seen her that day. She'd been absent from the one class we had together, and when I'd called her, she said she was feeling sick. It was nothing serious. She maybe had a cold or something. I'd told her to feel better, hanging up so that I could get to my next class. But as I saw her looking up from her cupped hands, I knew something was definitely wrong. I had never seen her cry before, and it was so alarming that I could do little else but go to her and wrap my arms around her. She wouldn't tell me what was wrong, but I wish now that I had pressed her. I wrapped her in my reassuring arms and tried my best to comfort her in her time of need. My reassuring arms quickly turned into drawing her close and wiping her tears away. This soon led to kissing, which led to touching, and then to the bedroom. I won't bore you with the details, but I think you know how it ended up. I woke up the next day, her hands lightly stroking my hair, and fresh tears running down her cheeks. It was our first time, and I couldn't even remember how it had gone. When I asked her to marry me a month later, she seemed overjoyed. We had been living together for half a year now, and our love for one another was pretty clear. She wore my engagement ring with pride, showing it off to her friends, and we began to plan our wedding. I was too blind to see that she was making appointments with a campus therapist more often than she used to. I was too comfortable to notice the tears that sometimes came to her while we lay in bed together. I was too wrapped up in my own feelings to notice the prescriptions that appeared in the medicine cabinet. I was just so comfortable that I never wanted it to end. It's easy to get tunnel vision when you're spending all your time in the tunnel of love, I suppose. After that first time, however, I did make efforts to be better in the bedroom. Kathy was patient with me, seeing that I was trying, but I often found myself trying one moment and waking up the next. She was always quick to reassure me that it was nothing to be ashamed about, but I knew it hurt her deeply to have a partner incapable of being intimate with her. So, I set out to find the reason for my sleeping fits. And so, I began to make doctor's appointments of my own. I said that the appointments were for her benefit, but I was honestly more concerned that I might have a real problem brewing. The last thing I wanted to discover at 22 was that I was a narcoleptic or had a problem with my brain or something. I explained what was happening to my doctor, and he was helpful, if not a little over-jovial. Kids your age shouldn't be having any sort of problems in that department, but we'll get you checked out, he assured me, with a smile and a pat on the shoulder. I was tested for every sleep disorder imaginable. I was given prescriptions of my own, but none of them seemed to work. I took supplements, signed up for new drugs that had just hit the market, and joined medical test groups. Despite all this, though, no one seemed to have any answer for what was going on. I was just so comfortable with my fiancée that I couldn't help but fall asleep in her arms. It would have been sweet if it wasn't worrying me to no end. We had decided on March for our wedding, the first anniversary of our meeting, and I was determined to make it special for her. I was as helpful and dutiful as a boyfriend/fiancé could be. I went with her to every stage of the planning. I picked out cake toppers, helped with seating charts, picked out menus, visited and put down a deposit on the venue, and comforted my soon-to-be wife every step of the way. The saving grace, of course, was that I could put my performance issues down as pre-wedding jitters as the day crept closer and closer. The wedding was easily the happiest day of my life. I stood at the altar, sweating in my rented tux, waiting for the moment she would arrive. The crowd huddled behind me in a murmuring throng of excited tension, and it felt like 1,000 years had passed before the music began from the organist. When I saw her in her dress, gliding down the aisle like a dream, I fell in love all over again. She was beautiful, her tears now ones of joy, and I never regretted asking her to join her life to mine. We exchanged rings, spoke vows of eternal love, and then walked from the church as husband and wife. As we stood for pictures, the venue having set up on the lawn to host our reception, I made ready to fulfill my end of tonight. I drank champagne for toasts and black coffee by the cup. I took caffeine supplements before we climbed into the car and left for our honeymoon suite. As she went into the bathroom to take her dress off, I walked around and tried my best to keep my heart racing. I told myself over and over again that tonight would be different, that tonight would repay for all the rest. I wanted nothing but to make her feel special and to make tonight one to remember. When she came out of the bathroom, the two of us standing before each other as husband and wife, I felt like I was possessed with all the energy and serenity I would ever need. When we woke up the next morning, intertwined as we always were, there were no tears on her cheek. Only a look of fulfillment I knew all too well. We settled into married life easily, and it was as though nothing had changed. Despite my best efforts, however, I couldn't recapture the magic of that night. Whenever I was in her arms, whenever we were close, I couldn't help but fall into that feeling of utter serenity and slip off to sleep. It was as if those feelings had multiplied after the wedding. She made me feel like I could die of happiness. I couldn't hold her hand as we drove anymore, lest I find myself listing off the road. If I cuddled on the couch with her to watch a movie, I would inevitably miss over half of it. I loved nothing more than to bask in that feeling of serenity that seemed to waft around her, but I also felt guilty as she seemed to return to her silent, tearful nature. I couldn't help myself. I was powerless to resist the pull of her, and I was powerless to do anything when I was in her arms. I began to notice as her mental health got worse, though. Kathy was moody and manic by turns. Sometimes she wanted nothing to do with me, only to cry and demand my attention. I often missed classes because I was afraid to leave her by herself, and I finally insisted that we go see a doctor. The doctor said this was normal. Her medication just needed to be adjusted. Despite their best efforts, though, the new pills and the adjustment of the old pills seemed to do no good. Our lovemaking was non-existent, despite my best efforts. I tried to comfort her, tried other means of intimacy, attended couples therapy with her, tried my best to keep her from imploding. In the end, though, it did no good. I remember the night it happened as vividly as I remember our wedding day. I was lying in bed, Kathy still in the bathroom, and I was worried about the appointment we had the next day. They planned to try her on a new battery of medications, and Kathy seemed to be willing to give it a try. She had wandered around the house like a fretful ghost all day, and I'd been keeping an eye on her until this very moment. I felt like if we could just get to bed, if we could just fall asleep in the comfortable embrace of each other's arms, everything would be fine. She climbed into bed, and something about her face didn't seem right to me. Then she opened her arms, and I was like a meteorite hurling into a planet's gravity. "I love you," she said, kissing my forehead as her heart raced against my chest. "I'll always love you." I fell asleep, wrapped in the arms of my love. sure that as long as I remained here, everything would be okay. I woke up, however, to discover that I was sleeping next to a corpse. I called the paramedics, but there was nothing they could do. She'd been dead for hours as I slept. Kathy had taken an overdose of sleeping pills before tucking in for the night. It was almost ironic in the end, and the note she had left on the nightstand told me everything I needed to know. All these years, I had believed that I was giving her the same feeling that she was giving me. It turned out I was nothing but a thief in the night. Kathy said that her mental decline had started almost the day we met. The balance and fulfillment that I had been expecting was a mirror to the anxiety that she was feeling. She had taken my inability to stay awake as something she was doing. She was boring me. I was disinterested. She was failing as a woman as a result. The longer it lasted, the more she felt like she was the cause. She wanted to please me, to be a good wife, but the longer it went on, the more inadequate she felt. She loved me. She never wavered in her love for me. But being with someone who was physically uninterested in her was killing her, physically and emotionally. She had finally decided that if sleeping next to her was what I wanted, then she would give me what I wanted. We would both sleep soundly for a change. I'm writing this as I sit in the viewing room of the funeral parlor. They gave me an hour before her cremation, a final viewing for her grieving husband. I could tell by the way they keep looking at me that I must look terrible. I've been awake for the past 5 days, and the bags under my eyes look more like suitcases. I've become accustomed to her presence, to the way she makes me feel, and now my sleep is all but non-existent. I'm like a junkie with no smack, and my fix lies in that box across the way, looking as lovely as the day we met. I think that when I get done with this, I may climb into that simple pine box with her and see if I can find some sleep. I can almost feel whatever she possesses from my seat here, and I want to see if she still possesses it, even in death. Who knows? Maybe I'll pull the lid closed behind me, and they'll simply slide me into the chute as well. It seems fitting somehow that the two of us should sleep forever, two souls at rest for all time. Hope you brought some tissues, because that last story was a real tear-jerker. But maybe we can lighten the mood a little bit with this next one. We all have our toys or our things that make us feel secure, that put our mind at ease. And when one of them gets broken, it's always difficult to know how to cope. So let's find out what happens when this man's karmagami gets broken. I envy these kids nowadays. That probably makes me sound like an old fart, but they really do have a lot more options than we did when we were their age. My youngest is neurodivergent, while my oldest has ADHD, which is bad enough to sometimes give him terrible anxiety. We have any number of things around the house to help with said anxiety. Poppets, fidget spinners, fidget cubes, sensory blankets, you name it, and we probably have it somewhere. My youngest son picked them up early, and they seemed to help him cope with the stress that his autism often brought on. My oldest scoffed at the gadgets my son had, but he left them lying around, and my oldest started playing with them too. Now he doesn't go anywhere without his fidget cube, and his hands seem glued to it around test time. All I had when I was his age was a worry stone, and I probably worried away more than a quarry of them. So when my youngest left his karmagami on the living room floor one afternoon, my first exposure to it wasn't exactly positive. If you're unaware of what those are, they're these little revolving toys that have different patterns on each of the faces. As you rotate it, the picture changes, and the transitioning images are supposed to be soothing. That, however, was not my initial reaction to them. He had left it in the living room floor beside the couch, right in a blind spot. So as I came around the corner one day, wanting to get a little lunch from the kitchen, I stepped down on the pokey end of the toy. After a few minutes of cursing and hopping around, I was ashamed to see that I had broken my son's new favorite sensory toy. I looked at the time and realized I only had about an hour to find a new one before he came home and had a fit. Quick trip to Walmart and $10 bought me an exact copy, but before I could leave, one of them caught my eye. It was a galaxy scene, the stars and nebulas giving me a strange, serene feeling. I decided to buy one for myself, feeling a little silly for wanting a kid's toy, but getting over it pretty quickly. As I sat at my desk and flipped through the scenes of open space, I felt a serenity I hadn't known since I was very young. I have a certain amount of anxiety myself, and the weird rotating thing soothed me when it all became too much. My wife rolled her eyes at me a little, but I noticed she wasn't in any hurry to get rid of her fidget cube either. So it sat on my desk, and there it was, well used and well loved. At least, until recently. I've been working on a book for the last couple of years, and it was finally beginning to come together. It was polished. The test readers I'd let have a look at it said they couldn't wait for the next chapter, and I was excited to get the final draft to my editor after so long. As I edited it, the little toy became the object most often at hand. I would turn it over and over without thinking about it, the galaxy spinning as my tale spun itself closer and closer to completion. I was turning it as I worked my way through the last fourth of the book, when something besides the swirl of the heavens caught my eye. I looked down, seeing the corner of the starry sky, and then I saw something on the face that was not the Galileo space probe or a black hole. It was eyes. I dropped the thing in surprise, but I had definitely seen a pair of bloodshot eyes. I could swear the veins had pulsed a little, the pupils staring at me, and I had been so startled by the intrusion that I picked my feet up into my chair like I thought it might bite me. I reached down after a few seconds of sitting like that, feeling silly, and when I picked it back up, I could see the familiar black hole and space probe among the bed of stars. I shook it off, thinking I'd just been working too hard. Started flipping the little toy in my hand again. As the words began to fall comfortably into place, I forgot about the eyes. I put it off as an optical illusion. It kept spinning and spinning, stopping only to make edits or change something here and there, and I didn't think about it again until later that night. I was talking with my editor on the phone, telling her about my progress and playing with the Karmagami, when it happened again. I figured I've got about 10 more chapters before I'm done with the third draft. I think then I might be ready to pass it to the proofreader so we can make it ready for publication. The absent-minded flipping was cathartic, my hands busy as my mind whirled over the things I still needed to do. I had to finish the second draft, get the cover art finished, get the final page count, and as I thought about it, my fingers flicked the little toy around and around. The spacescape spun faster and faster, the stars practically winking as I talked to Edith about the upcoming book. I'd forgotten about the eyes, chalking it up to stress, and the little thing hadn't been far from my hand since. "That's great, kid. If they're anything like the last pages you sent me, I can't wait to see them. Did you fix the problem you've been having with the third part?" "Yeah, I think so. I changed it so Mark and Ted move away while he kills Taylor." But the little toy had nearly slipped through my sweaty fingers, and I looked down to see the eyes staring up at me again. They were boring into me, judging me as they glared daggers into my Notre Dame t-shirt. As I watched the eyes, something emerged from the lower lip of the device, and I yelped as something bit me. I dropped the Karmagami and the phone I was talking on, looking down at my bleeding thumb as I shuddered on the couch. My wife and youngest son looked over at me, not sure what had happened, and I heard Edith from the floor asking what was going on. I reached for the phone, but my hands were shaking as the bite on my thumb bled. I apologized for the surprise, but the rest of my answer was a little less excited. When I felt my thumb throb, I looked down to find that the thing was back in my hand. I wanted to drop it, but I just couldn't make my hand release it. The space scene was back again. The eyes and teeth were gone, but my hands shook a little as I flipped through the pictures. I spoke absent-mindedly to Edith, but my eyes kept flicking down to the little puzzle toy. I expected to see the eyes again, but when the call ended, I let the phone slide down to the cushions and took the kagami in both hands again. "Boy," my wife said, "you sure are interested in that thing tonight." I nodded, but I felt a little cold as I kept flipping. My fingers felt crampy as I spun the image, unable to stop myself, and it no longer brought me the peace of mind that it once had. This was more like the feeling I used the device to forget, and the longer I held it, the more it made the emotions in me circle like a tornado. I had eyes only for the changing colors and patterns, and as they scrolled, I saw the depths of space open up, and the eyes returned to judge me. They swirled like galaxies all their own, the white orbs climbing up out of the depths of the void. The veins pulsed in the pale pools, beating to the tune of their own phantom heartbeat. I wanted to stop, but I was powerless as I saw that Cheshire Cat's smile oozing up as well. The teeth grinned wetly, drawing up at the corners as they ogled me. The teeth groaned like trees in a high wind, the mouth becoming a rictus as it continued to grow. The closer it came, the faster my hands moved. My fingers cramped, but they still worked as a blurry mechanism, faster and faster, closer and closer, the eyes and mouth rising from the void as my movements seemed to summon them into the world. I couldn't tell if I was leaning in closer or they were getting bigger, but the longer I turned it, the more it encompassed my whole existence. When someone suddenly covered the object in my hand, taking it away from me in one smooth motion, I was both relieved and infuriated. I was in bed, completely unsure of how I'd gotten there, with my wife looking down on me with concern. "I think you've played with your toy enough for one night," she said, taking it over to my desk and setting it down. I smiled at her, a single tear sliding down my face, but inside, I wanted to jump up and throttle her. For the first time in my life, I wanted to hit her. I wanted to slam her head against the desk until she stopped moving, and then I wanted to pick up that toy and start moving the pieces again. I railed against the feelings, but they kept surging forward like eels just below the surface. She must have seen something when she looked back, because she paused before coming back to bed. Her look was strange, almost fearful, but she settled as I adjusted my face into something more normal. "What's gotten into you lately?" she asked, coming to bed as I pulled myself back to reality. "Just working too much lately," I stuttered, getting up as I got into my pajamas. Even as I got ready, I couldn't help but glance at the kagami. It was just sitting there, calling to me, begging to be touched, but I turned away as I went to lay next to my wife. The urge to hurt her had passed, and as we settled into bed, I felt like my old self again. I just needed a little distance from my favorite worry stone, and as I drifted off, I made a mental note to just let it sit there tomorrow. I closed my eyes and opened them in a dream void. I was floating naked in space, a long umbilicus sprouting from my navel. I was drifting, moving towards the last thing I expected to find out there. It got bigger the closer I floated, and I expected that it would suddenly burst open and reveal a bright flash of light. Maybe this was where the eyes came drifting from, though I'd certainly never seen it on the stickered background of my fidget toy. The door was massive, roughly 20 feet tall, and it only got bigger the closer I got. As it loomed up before me, I suddenly found myself not wanting to sit in that shadow. I didn't understand how it still had a shadow. Did things have shadows in space? I didn't know, but I didn't want to come anywhere near this thing, as little say as I seemed to have in the matter. It opened suddenly, as I had expected, bathing my eyes in star-dazzling light. As I shaded my eyes to see what was coming through, I saw those glittering teeth as they opened wide and came down loudly around me. I came awake with a deep gasp, finding only my sleeping wife in the dark room. It was still on the desk then, that hateful pyramid, but I don't believe it stayed there long. When I woke up the next morning, my fingers ached, and I was already spinning the galaxies in my hand. My arms were shaking from exertion, the eyes and mouth already growing as they threatened to break the bonds of the Karmagami. I threw it away before I could think better of it, and when it burst against the wall, my wife snorted before falling back asleep. I just sat there for a moment, hands extended, not sure where I'd found the nerve. It was the last thing I had wanted to do, but now that it was star-strewn pieces on the ground, I felt more at peace than I had in days. It couldn't haunt me anymore, couldn't make my fingers cramp, my head ache, but even as I slid back under the covers, I could feel my fingers wanting to work the puzzle yet again. When I woke up and found it sitting on the desk, right where my wife had left it, I almost cried. Over the next few days, the little thing was my obsession, despite my better judgment. If I was awake, the little puzzle was spinning, spinning, spinning in my hands. My pages were forgotten, my family ignored. I couldn't help it. My mind was consumed by nothing so much as freeing whatever was trapped inside this thing, even though I was truly terrified of it. I would come to the precipice, the eyes ready to pop free of the canvas which held them, only to drop it before the snapping teeth could bite me. I would resist its pull for a few minutes, an hour at the most, but then I'd come to and find it in my hand yet again. My wife stopped nagging me about it after the second day, just sighing disgustedly anytime she saw me fiddling with it. At some point, she left to take the kids to school, and they didn't come back. I was aware of them the same way I was aware that every 8 hours I needed to eat, but I don't think it truly registered as something to be worried about. The phone was ignored, sometimes my body functions as well, and before long I was simply sitting on the living room floor in my own filth, my fingers rustling the drapes a little as they worked the picture at an eye-watering pace. I'm in one of my little breaks now, the device thrown against the wall as I try to resist the urge to use it. I took the time to get this down, hoping it would find someone, anyone, who might be having a similar problem. Sometimes the things that bring us joy are also the thing that destroys us. I don't know what sort of otherworldly being resides in this hunk of plastic and adhesive pictures, but it gets closer and closer to being born every time I pick the Karmagami up. For your own sake, if you ever see the eyes, don't fall into the same trap that has me. If you see the eyes, throw it away and forget it by any means possible. We're really coming down to it, slinging the hits and having a lot of good times here around the fire, while the wind rattles the eaves outside and we stay warm and dry here with some great tales and some great company too. So let's move right along from broken toys to the matter of inheritance. I've never really been in the middle of an inheritance struggle or really gotten much out of any kind of inheritance, honestly, as much as it would have been nice to get some. But I've been told that sometimes a good inheritance will come with some strange stipulations, maybe even some rules to follow. So let's hear about a fella whose inheritance came with some definitely weird strings attached. My grandpa was an odd guy. He was clearly wealthy, but no one was ever sure how. He lived frugally in a small house on a quarter of an acre, with a sensible car and nothing too fancy in the house. If you'd driven past it, you would have assumed that some old-timer on a pension was just moldering away his golden years there. And you'd have been right, in some ways. Where he showed his wealth was in his generosity. Grandpa liked to give. He gave the best Christmas presents. He had the best candy for Halloween, donated to charities, and liked to see people happy. If you asked him how he could afford to be so generous, however, he would always just wink and say he had his ways. Not even my grandmother knew where his money came from, and they were married for 50 years. So when he died, we all wondered who would inherit his mysterious fortune. My cousins had loved Grandpa. Grandkids always do, but the two of us had always been close. My old man hadn't even waited till I was born to go grab some milk and cigarettes, and Grandma and Grandpa had helped my mom raise me so she could go to work. I have a lot of fond memories of sitting with Grandpa and watching TV, taking walks around the neighborhood, and eating ice cream at this little shop on the corner. He would always tell me to appreciate the little things because the smallest things could be the ones that changed your life forever. "Take this," he would say, showing me the door knocker that he often carried in his pocket. "I found this when I was young, sifting through trash in a landfill as I looked for bottles to sell. It became my lucky charm, and it changed my life forever." Grandpa carried that door knocker for as long as I had known him, and it was pretty unique. It was a brass hand holding an apple, and it was all meticulously crafted in exhausting detail. The fingers had individual nails, the apple had a stem and leaves, and even the knuckles had wrinkles on them that had been carefully worked. I couldn't believe as a young child that Grandpa had just pulled this out of a dump, but he carried it everywhere, and I suppose it did bring him luck. The funeral was beautiful, everyone there having nothing but kind words for Grandpa and his family. After the service, my 3 cousins and I were asked to come to a will reading at the lawyer's office, and Grandpa had been as generous in death as he was in life. My cousins had received a trust fund for each of them, the amount payable on their 30th birthday, with a small living expense each month. Grandpa hadn't left a trust for me, but he had left me his little house, which I was pretty glad for. Mom had recently married, and though I liked Mike a lot, it had seemed a little odd to have her adult son living in the house that she was trying to make a new life in. Grandpa's old house was the perfect size for me, a college student with no real prospects of marriage in the near future. It was close enough to campus that I thought it would be ideal, but the lawyer had one more thing to give me. "Your grandfather was also very clear that I give you this," he said, and he handed me Grandpa's lucky charm, the brass door knocker. I thanked him, thinking I might hang it somewhere in the house in Grandpa's memory. It seemed only fitting to make a little memorial wall out of it. After all, Grandpa had loved the thing, and it had been his only constant possession for years. So I moved in that day, taking my things and wishing my mom and stepdad goodbye as I too embarked on a new life. Over the next few days, I changed the house around a little. I hung my flat screen on the wall, I moved Grandpa's favorite armchair around, I added my books to his bookshelf, and I donated his clothes and some of his other things to one of his favorite charities. I think Grandpa would have liked the thought that his stuff would help people in need, and they were very thankful. A few of them offered condolences, having read about his death in the paper. Grandpa bought a lot of his stuff from Goodwill and Habitat for Humanity, but he also donated a lot, so he was well known to them. It was Friday, about 4 days after the funeral, when I noticed the knocker on the counter and remembered my plan to hang it and make a memorial wall. I didn't have anything else planned for that day, so it seemed like a fine pursuit. I hung the knocker in the living room, putting it above the little shelf where I put some candles and a picture of Granddad. I put his wallet up there too, something else he was never without, and I added a tin of Altoids, a pocket watch I'd seen him wear, and a few other pictures of him. The door knocker was the centerpiece, and it all looked very nice when I was done. As I finished, I stepped back and admired it, thinking that Grandpa would have liked it too. That night was the first time I heard the knocking. I was lying in bed, doing some doom scrolling before I went to sleep, when suddenly I heard a loud thump from the living room. I took out my earbuds and listened, wondering if something had fallen over or maybe someone was at the door. But I didn't hear anything. I shrugged, thinking it had been my imagination, but just before I could slip the earbud back in, I heard it again. 3 long booms from the living room, then silence. I got up, wondering who could be knocking at my door at this time of night, and went to the front door and looked out the peephole. I opened the door to see if someone was joking around, but there was no one there. The front porch was empty. Grandpa didn't have any bushes or anything to hide behind. The kid, or whoever, would have had to been the freaking Flash to make it off the porch without being seen, and I closed the door and started to go back to bed. I'd come to the hallway that led there when I heard it again. 3 long booms, then silence. I turned back, looking at the door, but there was nothing. The knocking hadn't come from the door. I would have been able to tell. No, it had come from the living room. I glanced around, looking for someone at the window, or maybe the rattle of a woodpecker on the eaves, but there was nothing. I decided to go back to bed and try to make sense of it later, but that wasn't the last time I heard it. I heard the knocking a couple of times over the weekend, but I could never quite nail down where it was coming from. It was always either 1, 2, or 3 knocks, followed by a 10-second pause, and then the same number of knocks before it stopped. By Monday, I was pulling my hair out, wondering if this was the pipes or something in the walls. Then I finally caught it. I'd found a wedding picture of my grandparents sitting in a desk, something Grandpa had probably put away so he wouldn't miss Grandma too much, and I decided it would look very nice on the shelf with the other memories. I was adding the wedding picture beside one of Grandpa accepting an award for philanthropy when the knocking on the wall suddenly rattled and thumped. I jumped back, not sure what to make of it, but it thumped once, twice, 3 times, and was quiet for about 10 seconds. I had just thought it might be a fluke or something. Then it did it again. Thump, thump, thump. Then silence. I took it off the wall and looked for some kind of motor or something, but it's just a normal brass knocker. It happened 2 more times that day, and I was extremely curious as to what made it do it and why. I started going through Grandpa's desk, hoping for some explanation, and that's when I found the letter. It was in the middle of a ledger book, addressed to me, and it wasn't even sealed, which was unlike Grandpa. It was just a single page of notebook paper, and I was glad to see Grandpa's cramped handwriting speaking to me from the page. I hope you're enjoying the house, and I hope you found this letter in a timely manner. I'd considered leaving it to Wilson to give to you, but I thought it might be better if you came across it naturally. Also, I wanted you to receive the knocker, and Wilson may have decided to keep it if he read the letter. He's a good man, an honest man, but greed can do funny things to people. You've probably noticed by now that the door knocker taps on its own sometimes. You wouldn't believe how I discovered its power, a complete accident, but I swear that what I'm about to tell you is absolutely true. The door knocker opens to different places. Place it on a door and wait for the knocks. Once it knocks, open the door and travel to where it takes you. The knocker only has 3 destinations, but they have been of great benefit to me and our family. When it knocks, you'll have 10 seconds to open the door. The second set of knocks is the door closing, so it won't work if you catch it on the second set. One knock opens onto the treasury, a room of treasures. Coins, gems, gold, all piled to the ceiling. If anything guards it, it has never bothered me, but I'm always careful not to take too much. 2 knocks opens onto the library, a room stuffed with bookshelves. You can spend hours, days even, in this place, and Time won't pass outside the door. I've learned so many things here, things lost to time, and read about things that have yet to happen. 3 knocks opens onto a void, a darkness that I dare not enter. Anything you put in here will be gone. Anything. There's no ground outside it, though, so don't walk in. I'm ashamed to say that it's where I've been putting my trash, but it's also where I hid your dog, the one I said that ran away when you were young. He died suddenly, just lay over and died, and I put him in there before you woke up from your nap. I'm sorry I never told you, but you were so young when it happened that I didn't think you would mourn him for long. The knocks were never consistent, but each knock seems to come at least once a day. The 3 knocks usually come in the evening or the early afternoon. 1 knock is usually in the morning or before noon, and the 2 knocks come when it will. While you're inside, don't let the door close. I was stuck in the library for a long, long time once, and was fortunate that your uncle came along and opened the door. Time doesn't affect people the same way inside the door as it does out here, so spend as much time as you want there. If you get hurt, however, you'll be injured, so be careful. You and I have always been close, and I know that you and your cousins have speculated for years about my mysterious fortune. The knocker is yours to do with what you will, but always remember that money breeds difficulty, which is why I have always kept it a secret. Good luck. I love you, kiddo. I read through the note a few times, trying to make sense of it. There was no way. Grandpa had always been sharp, no real problems mentally, but this sounded like the ramblings of a madman or a lunatic. The knocker, however, had moved on its own, that much was true. It occurred to me that there was a way to test the rest of it, so I decided to do just that. I took the knocker off the wall where I had hung it and attached it to the closet door in the living room. It looked a little silly there, a door knocker on a door that opened onto a closet with 2 coats and a bunch of board games in it, but I wanted to be sure. It was silly, the kind of thing you read about in fairy tales, but I wanted to be sure. I had a while to wait, but it finally happened, just as I was thinking about going to bed. It was around 10:30, and I reached for the remote to turn the TV off when I heard it. 2 loud knocks, seconds apart, on the closet door. I popped up, remembering I had 10 seconds to get there, and threw the door open. I expected to find the same closet that had been there earlier. I expected this to be a joke from my grandfather. But I didn't expect to find the great library that he had talked about on the other side. It was huge, a library to rival any I'd ever seen, and the windows shone with perfect sunlight as I stood in shock. The shelves were tall, taller than the roof of the house I stood in, and they had long trestled ladders with wheels to slide along the floor. I could see a grand staircase, and I felt sure that there would be levels above the next as well. I could learn anything in there. I could learn everything in there. But I remembered what Grandpa had said about not getting closed inside, and I looked for something to prop the door open with. I saw an end table and pulled it over to put in the way, stepping inside and marveling at the space. I spent hours perusing books. There were books on languages, on history, on science, on anything I would want to know. I only explored the first floor that night, but there was enough there to keep me reading for days, maybe months. I was studying architecture at college, and there was a whole section of books I could use to study any period, any style, and anything else I wanted. This place was like the libraries they talked about in Alexandria, the libraries in the Harry Potter books, and some kind of wizard's private collection from a fantasy novel, all rolled into one. Time may have moved differently here, but it didn't stop me from getting tired. I'd been excited when I came in, but after a couple of hours, I was yawning and rubbing my eyes. I decided to come back another time and let the door close as I pushed the end table out of the way. It was true. I couldn't believe it, but I had seen it myself. Grandpa had a magic door knocker. I spent the next few days testing each knock pattern, and Grandpa's observations had been spot on. I found the room with the gold in it the next day, and it was almost more impressive than the library. Think of a room full of any kind of money you could want. Gold bars, U.S. currency, ancient denarii, little stones with things scratched on them, gems, pearls, silver nuggets, and other things I didn't even have a name for. I reached for a stack of hundreds with a shaky hand and brought them out before I let the door close again. I had made about $2,000 in a matter of seconds, and I put it somewhere safe before heading to class. The void was a little scarier when I got to it, but I'd been setting garbage bags beside the door just in case, and I was home when the knocks finally came. The void was just what it claimed to be. It was like looking out at a night sky, except there was no stars. It was an inky, unnatural blackness, and I wondered if maybe Nietzsche had been describing this place when he talked about staring into the abyss. The space was utterly devoid of anything, but it seemed to crouch as well, just waiting for me to drop my guard. The bags went in, falling into a soundless, airless void before I closed the door again. It was great for a while, truly a blessing. I had all the money I needed, and whatever I took seemed to come back after I shut the door. I could take books from the library if I needed to, and anything I left on the work tables would put itself away on the shelf. I spent a lot of time in the library when I got there, and sometimes I would wake up to find that I'd fallen asleep. The door never slammed shut and trapped me in there, and without anyone to come behind me and accidentally close it, I felt safe in there. I learned so much in a relatively short time, and my professors were impressed with my knowledge. I considered bringing them the books I'd used to gain that knowledge, but I thought better of it. How would I explain it to them? A guy in his early 20s who just happened to have a book that was probably hundreds of years old. It was something that would probably gain the attention of the wrong sort of people. I was careful not to use too much of the money, not to spread it around too much, and careful not to show anyone the books I got from the library. It went well for about 4 months, but then I started getting knocks of another sort from the door. It started subtly, with little knocks and taps from time to time. I'm sure I missed a lot of them, but I would sometimes look up as I was watching TV or reading, expecting to see the knocker tapping, but finding it silent. I started watching the door closer, getting strange lights wafting beneath it sometimes. They would skitter across the bottom like strange shadows, and I found myself watching them more than the TV after a while. My trips to the other places were still uneventful, the landscapes the same as they had always been, but it was the time in between the knocks that I came to dread. Then one night, something knocked back. I was brushing my teeth when I heard a familiar boom sound 3 times. I checked the clock and saw it was nearly 11. A little late for knocking, but I stuck my head out to look at the door nonetheless. The toothbrush was still in my mouth, and I had expected to see nothing stranger than the knocker fall back into place. Instead, something knocked again, and it wasn't the knocker. I came slowly out of the bathroom, watching as strange lights came flashing from beneath the cracks of the door. It was like a haunted house attraction, and I almost expected to see smoke billowing out from underneath it. The knocks were shy, almost uncertain, and I was preparing to head to my room when something hit the door hard enough to shake it in the frame. I jumped back, not sure what to make of it, and when it hit again, I fell onto my butt and just watched it shake. Whatever was knocking was adamant about getting in, and it slammed its weight into the door again and again. The knob rattled and shook. The lights flashed faster and angrier. My teeth were chattering. This had never happened before, and I was terrified that whatever it was might get through. It slammed into it again, the old wood cracking in the frame. And when it struck this time, I saw something break through the surface and come grabbing blindly from within. It was an arm, a long purple arm covered in scales. It thrashed around trying to find something to grab, and the sounds from within were like bats and birds turned up to 1,000. It shivered right on the edge of hearing, and I expected my ears to start bleeding. It was looking for the knob, and I wasn't sure what would happen if it found it. Instead, it bumped into the knocker. It fell off the door. It was only held on by a couple of screws, and as it clattered onto the floor, the most hellish sound of all ripped through the hole before cutting off as suddenly as it had begun. The lights, the noise, and the banging all stopped with a suddenness that made me dizzy. I stood up, looking at the broken door, and walked slowly into the living room to see the extent of the damage. Something was bumping, but I thought maybe the arm had knocked something over. I wanted to make sure the knocker was okay, but as I came around Grandpa's old chair, I saw what was making all the noise. It was the arm that had come through the door. It was leaking black fluid all over the hardwood and flopping around like a fish. It didn't flop for long, but now I'm left with a problem. The portal only seems to open when the knocker is up, but unless it's up, I can't open it. I wonder if this is why Grandpa kept it with him so often. Did he perhaps have a visitor one night when he least expected it? For now, I'm keeping the knocker in my bedside table, but even as I lay here writing this, I can hear it bumping against the wood every now and again. The money will eventually run out. That or my curiosity will get the better of me, and I'll hang the knocker again. But I think for now I'll let it sit. No need to invite trouble if I don't have to. One more story for you. Then I think it's time for me to hit the road once again. Our loved ones usually have a secret or two, some skeletons in their closet, maybe something they haven't shared with us. But if your significant other has a secret like the one in this next story, then it might be time to cut and run. 'Cause OP's girlfriend definitely has a secret. I'm an Uber driver in the Atlanta area. It's a great place to be an Uber driver, and there's always someone who needs a ride somewhere. I spend 6 hours a day in college classes, another 8 sleeping, and the rest of my time shuttling people to and fro around the Atlanta area. I've been doing this for about 3 years, and in that time, I've seen it all. I've had drunken frat boys that threatened to kick my ass when I wouldn't give them a ride. I've had annoying, nagging passengers who've constantly made me want to pull my hair out. I've seen the occasional cheating spouse hoping not to get caught, the local celebrity on their way to an event, the online influencer who thinks they're way more important than their subscriber count would suggest, just to name a few. I've had my fair share of funny moments, too. The man and his potential lover who met his wife on the sidewalk, the two ladies deciding to go get a drink after they had thoroughly screamed at him, never gets old. And I've also had some scary times. The lady with the neck wound who nearly bled out in the back of my car after her boyfriend just pushed her in and ran off came to mind, for certain. Despite all my experience, though, this story definitely falls under the weird category. Well, I guess we can upgrade it into the scary category, all told. Any night where I almost lose my life can definitely be called scary. This happened in October, about a week before Halloween. My girlfriend and I live in a duplex near campus. I've lived there for about 4 years, and she's lived there for about 6 months. We were taking a semester off since none of the classes we needed were available in the fall, and on the night in question, I was hurrying to get ready so I could drop her off at the airport before I started working. She was going on a weekend trip to see her parents in Virginia, and I'd have the house to myself all weekend. I was a little skeptical about her destination, but I decided to let her dig her own grave if my suspicions were correct. Maybe it was all the extra time I was spending at home, but I'd started to notice that something was a little off about her lately. She'd been fired from her job recently, and though she kept saying she was going to get another one, I didn't see her making any effort to do so. All she seemed to do was talk to people on Discord. She'd gotten really into this local group, spooky stuff from what I'd seen, and she was constantly chatting and texting with them. I was suspicious, but I wasn't really worried. At that point, I figured the worst she could do was dump me. We chatted on the way to the airport, talking about what she'd do once she got there, and how much she would miss me. She bemoaned how bored she would be at her parents' house, and when we arrived at the airport, she kissed me goodbye and headed into the busy terminal. As she left for her parents' house, or wherever she was going, I decided to get some work in, since I was at the airport anyway. I pulled into the temporary parking area and signed into the Uber app. The airport was usually an excellent place to find fares, and sure enough, someone was trying to get a lift. He wanted to go to a hotel nearby, and after agreeing to the ride, I moved back into the concourse to pick him up. He was a big dude, around 6 feet and muscular. He had a bag, which he put in my trunk, and a smaller bag, which he kept on his lap. I asked him where he was going, and he verified the address, so off we went. He was pretty quiet the whole way there. He looked cramped in my back seat, like a sardine in a can, but he took it well. Mostly he just played on his phone, typing away to someone as we rode in silence. That wasn't uncommon, and I honestly preferred clients who weren't chatterboxes. There was nothing worse than trying to hear your GPS over some drunk backseat DJ who wants the aux cord, or some tourist who wants a guided tour of the city as you dodge rush hour traffic. We drove for about 20 minutes before pulling up outside the hotel without much fuss. I told the guy we'd arrived, and he quickly slipped the phone into his carry-on and offered to tip me for arriving so quickly. I said it wasn't necessary, since that sort of thing was usually handled through the app, but he went ahead and slipped a 20 up next to my headrest, and I took it with thanks. Rules or not, money is money. He asked if I'd pop the trunk, and when he had his suitcase, he thanked me and walked towards the front of the building. I was getting ready to check the app for fares in the area when I heard a noise from the back seat. It was that high-pitched ding noise that so many phones use for notifications, and when I looked in the back seat, I realized the guy had forgotten his carry-on. It had slipped into the floorboard, and I could see the black light on his cell phone through the mesh. I dug out the phone and started to reach for the door when my eyes registered what the message on the lock screen had said. A picture of a pretty blonde was next to the message, and she was asking if he'd gotten to the hotel yet. Another popped up to say that she was running a little late, but she'd be there in 5. She couldn't wait to meet everyone, and she was so glad that she had finally done this. And it was about time they all got together, and the picture was of my girlfriend. I just stared at the phone for a few minutes before someone honked at me, and I drove into a parking spot. A cab had just pulled up behind me, and as I parked, I couldn't help but notice when my girlfriend stepped out and walked to the hotel. She still had her suitcase, her furry boots, her parka, the leggings that she had left the house in, and she smiled hugely as she looked at the hotel. She clearly hadn't seen me, which was good because I had about 1,000 questions I would have likely bombarded her with. She was supposed to be on a flight to Virginia, but instead, it looked like she was meeting some random guy from Discord. Was she cheating? Cheating seemed to be the most obvious answer, but why? We'd never had any problems. Our relationship had been smooth since the beginning. Why now was she... The phone dinged as another message popped up, but this one was from a different guy. "How many have arrived?" he asked. My girlfriend responded, "5, master. Damien seems to have lost his phone, but he's here too." I had meant to check for fares in the area, but instead I found myself watching the phone as the messages rolled in. I was in full information gathering mode now, and anything I could come back with would help me in the long run. If this was a misunderstanding or something, I wanted to know before I melted down on my girlfriend. As it stood, though, it was beginning to look very sketchy. I couldn't open the phone, of course. It was one of those fingerprint lock ones that wouldn't open without a password or a fingerprint, and since I knew neither, all I could do was watch the dialog boxes come up. The boxes only stayed for a couple of seconds, and often the messages were too long for the boxes to contain the whole thing, so I was forced to read a little at a time. What I read made me think my initial suspicions might be off. At first, it looked like she was meeting people at a hotel for an unspecified event. As I waited, I saw other people approach, their faces matching the images on the app. I was pretty sure that these people were the ones she was waiting for, because their arrival at the desk was followed by confirmation that someone else had arrived. After 8 or 9 of them had gone up, they began talking to the mysterious Master. The more they talked, the more I realized that this wasn't a weird sex thing. The group started talking about the Ascension and the altar site, to which he responded that they would learn more tonight. He asked my girlfriend if the sacrifice was ready, and she informed him that it would be there when the time came. He quoted some verses that sounded pseudo-biblical and referred to them as the coven several times. The more I read, the more I began to believe that she might be part of a cult instead. I sat outside the hotel for several hours, and as it got dark, he told them that the preparations were taking longer than expected. He told them they should meet him at the altar site and sent directions, which I got about half of. He told them to be there before dark, and like a flock of birds, they came from the hotel and moved towards cars parked in the parking lot. I ducked down, not wanting to be seen, and I watched as she got into a late-model black sedan. The sedan drove away in a convoy of other vehicles, and since I didn't have all the directions, I cranked my car and followed them. As they moved out of town and got onto the highway, I tried not to make it obvious that I was tailing them. The freeway was busy. It's close enough to end-of-day traffic that I can hide in a crowd, but as we left the interstate, it became harder to blend in. As the sun sank, I saw the turnoff for the access road, their cars kicking up dust as they rumbled down the gravel road. I didn't want to lose them, wherever they were going, so I pulled off the road for a few minutes before following. It turned out they were heading for Panola State Park. As I drove down the bumpy outlet road, the sun started to set for real. The trees started leaning in on me like hands in a funhouse, and the road was so narrow that if someone decided to leave, I'd be in for some trouble. The darkness had swallowed my car before I reached the end, and all at once, my headlights created beacons of light in the encroaching blackness. The park was beautiful during the day, but in the late-night shadows, it had a spooky look to it that only wooded areas in fall can pull off. I suddenly had Blair Witch flashbacks as I trumbled through the spooky backdrop. My girlfriend was definitely into some weird stuff here, weirder than even my imagination could have conjured up, and I knew that I needed to get her out of there before things got bad. When I reached the end of the outlet road, I found a dark parking lot with several cars in it. It must have been a campground at one point or another. I could see a bathroom and a picnic area off the parking lot, and the lot was flanked with lights that no longer seemed to work. I turned off my lights and got out of my car, but when no one immediately came out to get me, I figured they had moved on. I snuck around the building, and sure enough, they were bathrooms. One was a men's room, and one was a women's room. Both were unlocked, but the doors had that broken-into look. Someone had set up a couple of tents in the shadowy space between the building and the forest, but so far I'd seen no one. As I took a step towards the tents, however, a bright light sprang up to my left, and I saw a large bonfire crackling in the woods. It was off to the side of the campground, and for a moment, the sudden flash left me glare-blind. When hands caught me under my arms and dragged me forward, I was momentarily unable to fight back. By the time my eyes adjusted to the sudden flare of the lights, I was already close enough to feel the bonfire's heat and hear the chanting of those around it. It had been low at first, but now it had reached a fever pitch as they drew me closer to the fire. I struggled, but the two men who had me were much bigger than I was. I was pretty sure that one of them was the fare I'd had earlier, and we came up just short of walking into the fire. A robed man in a lacquered mask stepped up and raised his hand for silence, the chanting tapering off as they turned towards me. We stood in silence for 30 seconds before the masked man spoke. Unlike the muscle-bound guys holding me, the guy was not on speaking terms with physical exercise. His robes bulged in front, and had I not been suspended between two men, he would have still been a head shorter than me. When he spoke, though, it was apparent that he had power here. This one must be Master. As I told you, as Sister Serenity said, the sacrifice has arrived. Another robed figure moved away from the group and stood beside the fat robed man. She was about my height and had shoulder-length blonde hair. When I met her gaze, I realized it was my girlfriend. I wondered why I didn't recognize her at first, but it became apparent almost immediately. In the firelight, her hair was a frizzy mess as opposed to the straight and silky curtain she almost always kept it in. She looked almost feral as she stared at me, and I didn't see any of her usual warmth there. All of her love or happiness was gone, and she looked at me as though I were meat, like I was something that would bring her joy once I was cooked black and offered on a plate. I was put on my knees before her, and the fat man handed her a silver knife that he drew out of a scabbard like a magic trick. She looked at the knife like she'd never seen one before, and as she returned to reality, she approached me with the blade. I finally realized what I should have seen from the beginning. I was the sacrifice. He'd left the phone in my car on purpose, and even though there was no way she could have known that he'd get in my car, somehow she had. She'd meant for me to be here, for me to be her sacrifice. And as she raised the knife, I had to know why. "Why did you do this? I thought you loved me," I said, sounding pathetic, but still dying to know what this was all about. She looked at me, surprised, before saying, "Because it's why I got with you in the first place. There's always a sacrifice before the coming of winter. The green man requires a gift, and it was my turn this year. I had to have someone to give to the fire, and you were there to fill the role." And with that, she raised the knife, and I closed my eyes as I prepared for the strike. When the bullhorn sounded, it scared me just as much as it scared them. "Drop the knife and put your hands in the air. You're all under arrest for—" "Hey, don't move or we'll—" But it was too late. The knife clattered to the ground next to my head, and they all scattered like quail. I was dumped, face first to the ground, unceremoniously, as my two captors beat feet for the woods. The sounds of shouts and boots and the occasional gunshot surrounded me, and I lay still as I hoped not to be shot out of hand. Eventually a pair of boots came into my peripheral vision, and my hands were jerked back into flex cuffs as I was lifted up so the officers could have a look at me. A half hour later, and I'm in a detective's office with a warm cup of coffee and a recently freed wrist. We've been tracking these guys for years. They come to Atlanta the most often of any of their other haunts, and it leads me to believe that most of them are from here. About once every 3 years, we find a body at the state park. They take their organs, scribble some runes on the Vic, and just leave them there. Usually the animals have found them before we do. You're actually the first victim we've managed to find alive. It's a wonder we found you in time. He told me a lot of things that evening. He told me that this green man they all worship, some Eastern European god or something, and how they believe that if they don't make a sacrifice, he'll bring terrible fury down upon them. They always make a sacrifice right before Halloween, and it's always some random person they've probably known for less than a year. I gave him my girlfriend's name and the name of the guy from the airport, but he told me neither one checked out. Both were likely fake names, used to cover their tracks. Despite messaging my girlfriend, all I've received is a notice that the number has been canceled. So that's where I stand now. I'm afraid to go home because she has a house key. I'm afraid to go to my parents' house because she's met them. I don't know who to talk to, where to turn, or how many of our friends are involved in this little cult too. The detective told me to be very careful after all, because while they didn't catch my girlfriend, they did catch somebody. He took me to a little room with a one-way mirror in it and had me identify a pudgy guy in a robe. He was talking to another detective in a very animated way, the man staying calm despite the amount of flailing he was doing. He asked if this was the guy that my girlfriend had been talking to, the one they called Master, and I nodded. The man suddenly leaned forward and yelled at the detective, who sat back quickly despite the man's hands being chained to the table. Spit flew from his mouth as he yelled, even through the glass. I could hear what he was screaming. "You don't get it. You idiots just don't get it. We aren't worshiping the green man. We're all here to protect you from him. If this false sacrifice isn't received, then he will come. He'll come and he will kill. You have to release me. The sacrifice must be completed." That was about the time 2 other officers ran in and restrained him, but his message was clear enough. If anyone reading this has any information, I'd suggest you go to the police. These green man guys will have to strike again soon. If they believe that their actions keep us safe, if their delusion is something that must be accomplished, then any one of you may be in danger. I was groomed for 6 months, kept safe like a pig for the slaughter, but they don't have time to be so choosy anymore. The green man must be appeased, and soon, lest we suffer his wrath. Who knows which one of you might find yourself beside the fire this year? Just like that, it's time for me to ride off into the sunset, yet again. But don't be too sad. I'm sure there will be more good times and great stories coming at you tomorrow. So, until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.